Hey, everybody. Welcome to the gender reveal party. Today, I'm excited to share with you one of my good friends. His name is, I call him Jabo. His name is Jesse. And Jesse, welcome to the gender reveal party.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's nice to see you. Jesse and I have been friends. How long? We've been friends for quite a while now, right? I mean, the kids were
Yeah,
little.
2016, I think.
Yeah, okay. So five years at least.
Yeah.
So relatively new in terms of like my friendships, because I have a lot. But I wanted to share a little bit about our story. When I met Jabo or Jesse, it was a time, especially 2016, right? Because that was right after the election. And I started having exponentially a lot of people coming out to me as trans and or parents contacting me or people contacting me because I've always been that person. And
Yeah.
so normally when I do that, I meet with the person. They're usually a young person like you were. And then I'm like, okay, you should meet people your age, go hang out with them. And I did that, right? I introduced you to at least one other person your
Yeah.
age. Then I was like, but you're cool and you can hang out with us. Because even though I'm 55 and you're like, what, 20 something still, right? Not quite 30
32.
yet. 32. Okay. Right. But when we met, like you were still in your 20s. I remember that. You were like
Yes.
27 then, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, yeah, you're young. But anyway, you were fun to hang out with. So we became friends and we started watching games together and stuff like that. And so I really appreciated your friendship and watching you transition because when we met, you had, right? Had you started testosterone yet?
No, I
I
was
didn't think so.
still, in fact, it's funny because our first meeting, you were like, what pronouns do you want to use? And I was like, I haven't really thought about this. And you're like, I'm going to use he because that's probably where you're going to end up, right? And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. Like I just had like, I was still very much, I'm not even going to transition, right?
Right.
So it was, I would say I was in a lot of denial, but it was very, very early.
Yeah, it was early. And that's something that we can talk about for a second is that world of, in my work as a coach, I talk a lot about what you resist persists. And
Mm,
you and I have a similar story in the sense that every step of the way, going to getting on testosterone, I swore I was never going to do that. Right?
mm,
I was like,
yeah,
I'm not going to do that. Well, but I won't do that.
yeah,
Then it was like maybe testosterone, but not chest surgery. Okay, well, yeah, I'm definitely going to do that. No, I'm not going to do
yeah.
that. So what would you say? What's the source of that? Well, first of all, I want to just give you a stage and let you share a little bit about your story, and then you can speak to that if you'd like to. But I'll just shut up
Yeah,
after.
so I think it's really interesting because it's very easy to think about. You can connect the dots after it happens, but like while it's happening, it's not something that's like relevant to you. So I do remember like very early on always wanting to be like the dad. Like I remember you like play house with your friends, and I was like, I want to be the dad, and not really understanding why, but that just felt relevant to me. And I remember, you have this mental picture of yourself, and mine was always of a boy or a man. And I just assumed that's how everyone felt. And it wasn't until I was well into college, I think it was like a junior in college, and one of my really good friends and I were playing this game, like a get to know you game, and you give each other questions. And so the person answers and then you answer. And so one of them was, if you could be reborn as a man or a woman, which would you choose? And she went first. And so she said, essentially, even though it's harder, I really enjoy being a woman. And so without a doubt, I would be a woman. And I was shocked because I just knew she was going to say that she was going to be reborn as a man because that's what I wanted. And that's essentially what everyone wants. And that's when I realized I'm the one that's different, right? Like not
Right,
everyone is thinking this internally, has wanted to be a man their entire lives.
right,
And so that really kind of got the ball rolling for me thinking I might be different, but I didn't really, I didn't know what to do with that, right?
right.
Like we talked about it a little bit. I realized that I was different, and then I just kind of like put it away for a while. Fast forward, maybe like 3 or 4 years, I'm living in Thailand, and one of my coworkers who's American has a friend who is a trans guy who's coming to visit, and he was kind of at the point in his life at that where he had switched pronouns and name, but was going by initials. So this person comes, hangs out with us, and I don't remember the circumstances, but we ended up spending a day together, just the two of us. And so, now I would never tell someone to do this, but at the time I was kind of like, look, how did you get to this point? What was the kind of breaking point for you where you decided that you were going to not be a lesbian and actually be a man and like start your social and eventually moving on to a medical transition. And so we had a whole conversation, and in the midst of this conversation, this person is telling me their life story, and I'm hearing my life story being told to me by someone who has never met me. I've never shared any of these things, and yet there's so much they're saying that I could relate to. And suddenly I'm thinking, okay, like there's a word for people like me. But this person was white, and I remember us talking, and I'm saying, that sounds really cool and great, but I'm Black, and Black people don't do that. So that's off the table for me, right? And I don't even think I could have named a trans Black woman at the time. This would have
Right.
been early 2013.
Yeah.
I just didn't know, and so it just didn't feel like something that was possible for me. And that was a big kind of moment where it's like I can see a potential future. I finally find someone that I can connect to, and I know I'm not alone. But also, I feel like that this is not an option for me.
Yeah.
Then fast forward, I go to, and I like told a couple of friends along the way, like, hey, I identify as trans. They asked me what that meant, and I don't know what that means. I know for sure I'm not gonna do testosterone. I'm not gonna have any surgeries. Don't even know if I'm gonna change my name. Right? It's just an important thing that I think you should know about me, but I don't know what it means. I start grad school, and I was moving to Lawrence, and one of my professors said that I could stay with her while I was looking for housing. If you need, like, come stay with me for a week while you're looking for places. So my first morning there, we're having breakfast, and to this day, I do not understand why I told her. But I said, oh, I identify as trans. And without missing a beat, she says, oh, that's great. I actually have this guy, Jay Pryor, who comes to my classes. I bring him for ethics. I think you should meet with him. And so I met you, and we had our like moment where I was like, I'm not doing any of these things, but it's like cool to meet someone else who is trans. And I think over the course, like within 3 or 4 weeks of us meeting, I decided that I was going to transition, because although you were still a white guy and I hadn't met any Black guys at that point,
Right.
you were a guy from small town, or a person from small town Kansas. I was also from Kansas, and I thought, if this person from a family of 9 kids from middle of nowhere Kansas has people that love them, has a family, is married, has kids, like I can see myself doing that as well. And so suddenly that opened the door where it felt like a possibility for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a bit of a planner. So I remember telling my therapist, okay, in a year, this is where I want to be. How do we do the work to get there? And that was really the jumpstart for me.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Could you say more about, just so, for the really dim white people in the back, why the stop around being Black, right? Like Black people just don't do that. Like that was your words. Were like, well, Black people don't do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't. So, I mean, to speak that specifically, I didn't know anyone who had done it, and I think that there has, at least in growing up, there was this sense that I think a lot of people assume that Black people are homophobic or transphobic. I think that there are Black people that are homophobic and transphobic. I don't think that that is true of the entire community. My story speaks to that, which we can talk about later. But just not have, I didn't know anyone Black who had done it, so it felt like a very white thing to do. In the same way that people talk about, like, I don't really know any Black people who go camping, so I often joke that, like, that's a thing white people do. That doesn't mean that Black people or other people can't do it. There just isn't representation of Black people doing it. And so it felt like I was going to be a pioneer in this thing, and that felt very scary and inaccessible to me.
Right.
It's nice especially when you're doing something, if you're one of the few people doing it, to say, oh, this person's doing it with me, or I can look to this person. Without having that, it just feels very scary, overwhelming, and like maybe that's not an option for you. You won't be accepted. And I was already kind of the weirdo in my family, so to be the one that's going to do something without being able to point to someone else, that just felt like a non-negotiable for me. That's not something that I feel that I have the mental aptitude to do at this point in my life.
Right. And now that you've, 2020 hindsight, you've already transitioned. And at this point, you've like basically gone through, you've been on testosterone for 4 or 5 years, 4 now.
4 years.
Right. So you're kind of in the middle, actually, because it takes 7 years for the whole thing to go, but you're 100% like viewed as male now in the world.
Yeah.
Have you since been able to connect with other Black trans men?
Yes. So when I was in Northeast Kansas, when I started, I connected with several Black trans men, and that was an interesting experience because we were a lot of things we shared, but then they were like, we were just in different places in life, so I didn't always find that to be as helpful. Then I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, after I graduated, and I found a community of about two or three Black trans men that I was able to connect with there, and we became really good friends. I started going to a conference, the Black Trans Advocacy Coalition. They have a conference every year in Dallas, Texas, and so
Okay.
I've met a lot of people, and I've been able to connect with them. We don't talk every day, but it's nice to have people who are in different stages experiencing different things to connect with. And then I have since moved back to Northeast Kansas and have connected with even more trans men. So I do have a group of guys, well, I wouldn't just say guys, trans people. There are a number of non-binary people that I've connected with since who do provide support, and we're in it together, which has been very helpful.
Yeah, and I think that one of the most, that's one of the reasons that when a trans person gets in touch with me, the very first thing I try to do is get them in touch with other people who are just like them. Or there's
Yeah.
something about, in GLSEN, we often talk about, GLSEN teaches that kids need to see, they obviously need to see a window. They need to be able to look out the
Mm.
window and see other people who are not like them, but they also need a mirror, right? They need to be able to see themselves. And that's something, even though you're quite a bit younger than me, you didn't really have a mirror growing up. You didn't have anybody
Right.
who looked like you, who thought like you, who acted like you. And it's
Hmm.
so important. And in my life, even going to butch femme events or trans events where there are other trans humans or non-binary humans, that connection is more powerful than anything else I've ever experienced. I mean, it's so powerful. And part of it is, I guess, it's just that lived experience. Like my lived experiences, I can hear them, like you said, someone's telling their story, they're telling my story, even though I'm
Hmm.
not talking. Like
Right.
it's so powerful. And I think that people, especially white people that don't grasp at all, really don't understand how important it is that you not only be able to connect to other trans people, but other black trans men, because your experience is completely different than mine. So I was literally handed white male privilege overnight, right? It seemed like it once I started growing a beard. Interestingly enough, when I was in DC, so I was in a very diverse community out there. And when I was, back when I was transitioning, I had to live for a year passing as a man, because that's the words we used back then. Live for a year without any hormones. The only people that ever pegged me as female were black men. Like the
Mm.
only people ever.
Mm.
It was
Yeah.
mind blowing to me because
Interesting.
everywhere else in the world, people saw me as male,
Yeah.
but without hormones, man, black men called me she, tagged me as female every single time. And it
Hmm.
was
Interesting.
just it was interesting to me on a couple levels. One was that I think that in the black community there's a different definition of female and how female looks and how female shows up, right?
Hmm.
Because there's black women with shaved heads, right? That's not a
Yeah.
thing. In the white
Right.
community, if you have a shaved head, you're a lesbian usually,
Yeah.
or
Fair.
a feminist or something. You know what I mean? There's something that's like that's a signifier in the white community. If you're a white woman with a shaved head, you're making a statement or you're a lesbian or something. And so, really short hair doesn't say anything to black men about
No.
whether you're a female or not. But it was just fascinating and interesting to me that was the case, and so important that I started to really understand the difference than when I was handed, once I grew in the beard and I was, according to everybody, I was a white man, how different I started getting treated. You had a
Mm.
different experience, right? Where you were seen before as probably a black lesbian would be my guess, right?
Yeah.
Definitely black
So to speak.
female.
Yeah.
And now you're perceived as a black male. Can
Yes.
you speak to that difference and how you get treated differently in the world, how you're perceived differently in the world?
Yeah, so I would say that I always wore kind of like, oh, I wouldn't even say they're masculine clothes. Like I just wore t-shirts and jeans. Like my youngest memory is me wearing t-shirts and jeans. That's just kind of been my thing. So it wasn't even a reflection of my sexuality or identity. It was just I'm lazy. T-shirt and jeans are comfortable to me. So that's kind of like just been my MO for a really long time. And so I think that when I would walk into spaces as a woman, um, I think there was always this assumption because I was like, I'm bigger. I'm not super tall, but I'm like 5'9". I'm a bigger person. And so I think there was always this assumption that I was a quote unquote angry Black woman until I started talking. And then that was immediately erased. Um, and so I could see people, there would sometimes be a tension or people would look at me differently until I started talking. And then the room shifted, right? But generally, I wasn't seen as a threat. I could kind of exist and be fine. As soon as I started testosterone, and really, I wouldn't even say that I was doing anything differently, but as I was being perceived as more masculine, I did see major changes. So I'd be walking, in the evening I lived 2 blocks from campus. And so in the evening, I'd walk from the library back home. And if there was any woman, regardless of race, on the sidewalk, and I was walking behind them, suddenly they would start walking faster. So I just immediately, if there was a woman walking on the side, I just walked on the other side. It's like, I'm just trying to go home. I have no interest in you whatsoever. I'm just trying to go home. And I also saw that tension that would happen and ease once I started talking. It didn't ease. That tension would always kind of be there. And suddenly I would notice that people were looking at me more when I walked, whereas I definitely felt more invisible as a woman. I could just kind of like exist and there was no issues. Suddenly it's as if everyone noticed me when I walked places and they were very much aware of my movements and where I was. And that was very different. I just felt like I was always being watched all the time and I wasn't able to move as seamlessly as I had been before.
Yeah. And I mean, having been raised classically trained female, which I talk about in the show, right? That I
Yeah.
was classically trained female in the Midwest. We all, as women, were raised to safety plan all the time, right? I mean, women
Yes.
are always safety planning.
Yeah.
I've many times walked down the street and tucked my keys between my hands because some guy's walking behind me, or took a different route, or like, and so then as a guy, like, we see when women do that now. I mean, when we're being perceived as male anyway, even though
Yeah.
I'm a non-binary human, people perceive me as male all the
Mm-hmm.
time, and we can see that happening in front of us. It's so frustrating. That's my most frustrating piece for me about being perceived as male, is that I'm dangerous, right? I'm being perceived
Yes.
as dangerous. You get a double load on that, right? Because
Yes.
historically we view Black men as dangerous and criminals.
Yeah.
And so you get that piled on top of you. How is that? Has that impacted? Do you feel like that impacts your relationships at work? Do you feel like you've seen a shift in your work since then?
No, and I think that's because really early on, I learned that the way to, again, when I was as a woman, I'd show up, people, there might be some tension. I start talking, that tension would dissipate. In order to dissipate that tension, pretty early on, I often out myself as a trans man in some way. Because then it says I'm a man, but I'm a different type of man, not the one that you were expecting. I'm not a threat to you. And
Right.
that seems to kind of dissipate the tension. And so pretty early on, I just learned that I'm gonna have to out myself all the time and do it very early. And that's a way that I protect myself as a safety mechanism. So I haven't really seen too much of that because I'm pretty quick to do that. When I don't out myself, people pretty, I would say that it doesn't dissipate as quickly, but the tension does decrease because once I start talking, people just assume that I'm a flamboyant gay man and therefore still not a threat. So that has been helpful to me. And I wouldn't really say there's necessarily anything flamboyant about me.
Mm-mm.
I always say that I really like wearing ties. I like men's dress wear. Outside of that, I don't think there's anything that's inherently masculine or feminine about me. Um, I'm pretty androgynous outside of that. I just happen to really love ties and men's dress wear. So because of that, I wouldn't say that I talk with my hands, but I'm not necessarily flamboyant, but I'm perceived that way. So I just kind of let people run with that. Like, yeah, if you want to think I'm a flamboyant gay man, if that makes you feel better, great, because that's going to be safety for me.
Right. And, I remember that, I have a trans kiddo, and he got called a faggot the other day.
Mm.
And, I was telling him, you can look at that a couple of ways, right? Because if you want to be perceived as male, at least you got that.
Yeah.
Because I remember so distinctly living in Washington, D.C. and walking down the street and having gay men hit on me or flirt with me, and me being like, that means like to gay men, they see me as male. So I was like,
Yes.
yes. At the time, that was a
Yes.
woohoo. That was a big win for me.
Yeah.
And the same thing, it's really interesting because I thought I was so butch as a woman, right? I mean, I just thought, man, I'm as butch as any
Mm.
dude, right? Until I transitioned, and then I was like, oh no, I'm lighting the loafers. Like I'm really lighting the loafers for a guy.
Yeah.
And so people do perceive me as a gay man. And if I get called a name like that, generally I'm just like, thank you for noticing. I appreciate you for that. So one of
Yeah.
the things that you started to talk about that I want to touch base because I talk about this in the show, and part of our commitment is to reveal gender. So just to
Mm.
be specific, because I know that that you train on this stuff as much, if not more, than I do. But one of the things we like to talk about is the distinction between gender identity and gender expression.
Mm.
And so so you would say your gender identity is
Male.
male. And you don't put a qualifier on that by saying trans male or trans man. You just say man or male.
I just say, man, depending on the context, I think if there are more like people who, if I'm just in, it depends on the context. Occasionally, I mean, I would say more often than not, I probably do say trans man, but sometimes you don't want people to know, not
Right.
because I'm trying to hide anything,
Just to
but
be safe.
because to be safe, but also because I don't want to answer all your questions. Like
Thank you.
I just want to show up in this space, exist, do what I need to do, and go on about my life. And I think sometimes when you drop that trans in there, people, oh, you're trans? I would have never known. When did you transition? And it's just like I don't want to do that. So my default is to say male, but I guess I probably would say that I identify as trans male.
Yeah, and for me, I used to use that trans modifier because I mean, like, I'm not a man, I'm a trans man. So people
Mm.
understood that I had one foot in woman. Because back before we had non-binary identification, I was always identifying as a genderqueer,
Yeah.
but nobody had those words. So I would
Right.
use trans man so that people understood that I was like, I'm out as a trans
Mm.
person. I'm not a
Yes.
cisgender man, right? So
Yeah.
people would get that distinction. Um, and like you, you know me for 5 seconds, I'm coming out. And part of the reason is I don't want to be perceived as a bio male, or what's what we used to call them, cisgender male
Yeah.
these days. So your gender identity is man, and your gender expression is, like you just said, usually pretty masculine or non-binary.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you don't know about Jesse is that he does love ties, but he was also a master tie tire. Is there a word for that you like? Is there a word for tie tire? Like,
I don't know, like,
we should
because
come up
it's
with
usually you're
one.
doing it in knots. So like, yeah, I don't know. Whatever person who ties knots is would
Yeah,
be.
is that a word? So people
I'm not
we'll have to
sure.
look that up. Someone who
Yeah.
ties knots, but he's brilliant. Like I have a tie I won't untie that he did for me because it's so perfect. Just like I just try to keep it there. Someday I'll have to clean the damn thing, but but I try not to untie it because it's such a cool looking knot. And somehow, when did you get into tying knots, tying ties?
um. So before I like 2014 to 2016, I lived in Northern California, and I was there was a policy in my job. We'd always been kind of like business casual with emphasis on the casual part. And so they like a few months after I started, they kind of decided that every man was gonna have to wear a tie. And I always really, really, really wanted to wear a tie. So I thought, in solidarity with my male, coworkers, I'm gonna wear a tie too. And I called it gender bending. And so I was wearing ties, and I really liked it. And one of my friends said to me, you look really great in a tie, but you need to change up the knot. Stop wearing the same knot every time, which is really funny to me now because at any given time, 90% of men are wearing the same knot and they
Most of them
only
don't know
wear
how to
the
tie.
same
I don't know. Most men don't know how to tie
knot.
ties, other than that little half knot thing that I do. Right?
so so I was like, I want to learn more Thai. So that's like, her emphasis of be different, stand out. I started learning more knots. And so there's probably about like 5 or 6 that I kind of rotate through regularly. But that it's kind of become my signature where depending on how I'm feeling, what's going on, I use a knot for that occasion.
I love that. I love that. So, in the show, we talk about being classically trained female. We talk about, I talk a lot about, the moving through the world, having decided that the body I was born into was not mine, right?
Hmm.
Not officially. And for me, I feel super great because I feel like now going off testosterone, I've kind of got my old lady soft skin and my old lady beard back and all that
Yeah.
good stuff and don't have the man brain. How do you feel about where you are in your transition? You feel good about it? You're happy? Things are going well? All that good stuff.
Yeah, I feel really. I mean, I do wish that I could grow some more hair. Lacking in the beard area. That's the one place
Right.
I think I'm not quite self-conscious, but I would like to experience a little bit more there. But overall, I'm feeling the best that I've ever felt in my life. I think every year as I approach the anniversary of taking my first shot, I find myself not only feeling very grateful, but just excited about how far I've come. Right, thinking
Yeah.
about pre-testosterone, where I was at 1 year, all those things. And so every year I just feel more and more in line with my body. I remember, there was a point in my life where there was a total disconnect, right? Like I existed as a soul within a shell, and now we are like aligned. I feel one with my body, and I'm like very, very, I don't know, I'm just happy. I'm the happiest I've ever been, and that has been one of the best feelings I could ever experience.
Yeah, it is. I love that. I love that you're happy. Could you explain in your words why, when we choose not to come out, and part of it is because we don't want to deal with all the questions, right?
Mm,
And especially that one where people say, "Gosh, you look so good. I would never would have known." Can you
yeah.
explain to our audience why that's borders on rude? Like it's inappropriate and borders on rude. Can you explain that to them?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's like I think a similar one is like you think about a blonde woman, right? And someone's like, "Oh, you're really smart for a blonde." Like that's not a compliment. It doesn't feel good. And so when people tell you, "Oh, like I would have never known," like that's not a compliment. It's saying that, oh, it almost comes off as like, "Oh, you're really good at lying, or you're really good at hiding something." And it's like, I'm not hiding anything. I'm just being myself. It's not my fault that you assume that a male or a woman or even a non-binary person looks a certain way and I don't fit what you thought would look, or you think that I'm hiding something, right? So to me, it just, when someone says that to me, it's like, oh, you're really good at lying. Like I would have never known you were lying to me, but I'm not lying to you,
Yeah.
and so to me, that's why it's rude.
It also, for me, it has this world of like, it just screams, I don't know anything. Like, especially the world for trans men,
Mm,
that anybody who tells me they can pick a trans man out in a lineup, you're lying. Like that's
yes.
just impossible. Like
Yeah.
you're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Like if a guy has been on testosterone for at least 6 months, and especially if they've had chest surgery, you can't you can't
Right.
pick us out in a crowd.
No.
And the fact that people think that they can pick out trans people infuriates me. It's
Yeah.
so annoying. And that's part of that question for me says, I know better. Like I could have picked you out in a crowd, right?
Right.
You must be you must have some magic where you're passing. It's like, I don't have any magic. This is what
No.
trans people look like.
No.
We look like normal people or normal. We look like regular old people.
Regular people. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
we
no
just
difference
like
between us and anyone else.
yes, yes. And then it also speaks to that world of transphobia, I think, where it's like if you didn't, right? If you didn't, then I may not even be having this conversation with you. Right. It's like
Right.
if you weren't passing or you didn't look good to me, then I may not even talk to you.
Mm,
And that's hard for me too. It's
yeah.
like I'm safe, right? Because I look and because I'm white and look like, you know, howdy
Right.
doody or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm not a threat in any way.
Yes, but I also think it speaks to the fact that people have this assumption of what trans people look like, because
Right.
for the people who don't, blend or pass as well, like there could be a lot of factors there. Maybe it's because they don't have access, but also what if they don't want to? Laverne Cox is very famous about talking about there was a point in her life where she was like, I can have all these surgeries and I could really, really pass. And then it occurred to her that that's not what she wanted to do, right? So if you look at her hands are very big. They're not delicate women's hands, and she's very proud of that, right? And I think that different people will choose different routes. Some people can't take hormones, or they choose not to because the science isn't there. We really don't know what happens when you're on hormones for 30, 40, 50 years. Like a lot of us are guinea pigs waiting to find out what happens. And some people don't want to take that risk. So there's like a lot of factors as to why a person will choose not to or can't look a certain way. And I don't think that makes them any less trans. That is a choice or circumstances that they are under. But they're just as valid in their transness as I am, or you are, anyone else, right? Who has access and privilege to other things.
Right, 100%. I mean, and for me, like going off the testosterone, like my hands are now, one of the things I noticed like 6 months in is, you know how when you go on testosterone, you start noticing all the hair, like you're just like, what? I have a hair, like it's just
Mm-hmm.
same thing happened, only the opposite. Like I looked down and
Mm.
I had no hair on my hands.
Oh,
And it
interesting.
was like my arms, my hands are back to non-hairy, and I look at my hands
Yeah.
compared to my brother's hands now, who has hair all over them, and mine used to look just like that.
Hmm.
And I look at pictures of myself. I have a picture of myself that at some point I need to go get an updated shot. A picture of myself being silly and with sunflowers and putting them over my breasts like my friends did, right? I'm with shirt
Mm-hmm.
off, but I'm hairy, right? I'm like really hairy
Mm.
everywhere.
Yeah.
And so all that disappeared, right? And it's all gone. I don't have any of that.
Interesting.
None of, yeah, it's all gone. The only hair that
Oh.
stayed is my beard, and it's old lady soft hair, right? But what's interesting to me is people don't notice that. Like all they see is man. Like they still
Mm-hmm.
just see me as male. And
Yeah.
that's like if I shaved off my beard and I didn't have a receding hairline, I have my hips back. I have my female body is completely back minus the breasts. So for me, I feel amazing because I feel like I got all the good stuff that I wanted from the lesbian side or the female side. Plus I get the beard and no tits. So I'm like, woohoo. I'm literally half and half.
Nice.
And that feels total in alignment with who I am,
Hmm.
which is fantastic. And the only frustration is like, that doesn't people don't notice that. That's the only thing that they notice is man. So I still get put in that man box all the
Mm.
time, and I'm still coming out constantly because of that. Because that's for
Right.
me, it's like I have to come out so people see me as myself and don't make assumptions about my lived experience as a growing up as a cisgender white male, but also just so that I need to feel like I don't feel like I have to, but I want to be authentic with myself, but also I want to represent, and I want people to know that we exist and know that, we're not all just going to fit in that pink or blue box.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's fair.
So, Jesse, you're now working in the corporate world, right? And you're
Yes.
doing diversity, inclusion, and belonging work. So, I want to
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge and appreciate you for that work because I know that's something that you wanted to do for a while, and
Thanks.
that now that you're doing that and getting to make a difference with that world. Is there anything you'd like to share with our audience or leave them with? Any words of advice? Anything you'd like to share? Anything we didn't cover?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's okay to ask questions. You don't want to ask people invasive questions, right? So, if someone says to you that I am transgender, genderqueer, like it's okay to ask them, what does that mean to you, right? One, because while words mean things, they mean things to different people. So making sure that you understand what it means to that person, because a million people could identify as queer, and yet it means something different to each one of them. So really knowing what it means to that person. I think it's okay to ask questions. Again, we're not asking personal questions like, when did you do this? Did you have this surgery? Like that's invasive, but really asking a person about, someone says something to you, what does that mean to you, right? How can I support you? Those are questions that we can ask. So I think it's okay to ask questions, and I'd also pair that with research. Like Google exists, it is free. You can find so much information from Google. I can't tell you the number of times people ask questions, and I really think I answer them because it's my job, but I think to myself, you couldn't Google that? Like Google is there, it is a great resource. When I came out to my family, I came out in a letter, and I provided a lot of information about myself personally, you know, what my timeline was and all of this. And then I even included FAQ, here's some questions you may have about what to call me, all these things. And the last thing it said, I am more than happy to answer any questions about me personally, right? But if you have questions about transgender people in general, Google is a great resource. I recommend you start there, right? And that's what I would say to everyone is you can ask questions, but Google will probably answer most of your questions. And the people in our lives, whichever marginalized identity that they have, they're not going to be your Google or your Wikipedia. They can answer questions about their personal life if they feel comfortable or want to. They don't owe you anything. But general questions that you have about any community, please start with Google.
Absolutely. And one of the things that and as a business consultant, I think that we share this. I try to make sure that businesses understand that you need to hire and pay trans people that
Yes.
are doing this work. Like you and I get paid money to do
Yes.
this work. Do not expect your transgender employees to be the ones to, even if they're out like me, even if they're as out and loud as me, right? Do
Yes.
not expect your transgender employees to run your trans awareness day or trans, like it's so inappropriate and not
Yeah.
okay, right? You need to hire people, right? Pay them money to educate your
Yes.
staff on they, them pronouns, all the whole things that we get paid to do.
Mhm.
It's just not fair to ask your trans employees to do that. So I want to make sure to emphasize that.
Yes, that is very
I
true.
think that happens a lot, somebody like one of us that's out and we love to educate people. It's part of, who we are
Yeah.
as people anyway. But it's just not, it's like, make sure you go outside of your business to get those questions answered. So,
Everyone's not an educator, so
right.
find the people that
Exactly.
are.
Right. And it really can intimidate an employee or really put somebody in a bad spot, even if because you're their boss or because, they're at work, they may say yes, or they may, but right, might really just put them into mental health wise, it's not always the best place to do to put somebody on the spot
And
like that.
also, they may not know everything. Like, people, tell me that I'm expert, and I really reject that title. I'm an
Same,
expert in my experiences. I'm a co-learner in everything else. And
same.
I think that, just because you have a trans employee or a Black employee or an Asian employee, like they're expert in their experiences, but they may not be able to speak to information across the board that's going to be helpful for the organization, right? So
Right.
just because someone holds an identity doesn't mean that they are an expert in that identity, or
Hmm.
they can provide valuable information across the board for the organization. So that's important to keep in mind too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm constantly learning new things. In fact, I need to go redo my video to add the 2S into the stream
Mm.
of letters,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm putting first. Sometimes people are putting it last. It kind of depends. I don't know
Yeah.
if there's no stamp of approval yet that I've known about in the
Yeah.
gauging, but so, but I'm constantly learning, and I appreciate that so much, and especially learning from younger people. I've been doing this for longer than you've been alive, so I'm grateful to kind of pass the torch a little bit and learn from and see that so much is changing, and I really appreciate you and who you are for the world, and I adore you and I appreciate you. And I
Thank you.
just am really happy and grateful that you came on the show. I love being able to share my friends. You're under the friends and colleagues category, and you're both a friend and a colleague in terms of our the fact that we're both 2S LGBTQIA plus educators. So thanks for
Yeah.
being on the show. Thanks for being my friend. I really appreciate you. And
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I mean, like, this sounds cliche, but I wouldn't be here if I hadn't met you. So, I'm very, very thankful for the opportunity to be here and share my story.
awesome. Thanks.